Today on The State of Us, where is America diversifying the fastest? Small Midwestern towns. Does the answer surprise you? Let's talk about the details. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, by our friendly redneck liberal, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. And today, we've got an interesting one for you. 94% of Ohio teachers are white, but diversity is rising fastest in the Midwest. So there's some interesting dynamics going on here we're going to have to talk about. Why is it rising faster? What does that mean for these communities? And will it be primarily beneficial, or could it be a hindrance? We've got a lot to discuss, but before we dive in, Lance, what's the word of the day?
Well, we've got a 3-syllable word. The word is catalyst, C-A-T-A-L-Y-S-T, used as a noun, and it refers to a person or thing acting as the stimulus in bringing about or hastening a change, a catalyst. And I think that's what we have going on here. We have changes occurring, and maybe we can talk today a little bit about what is the catalyst, and then with the change occurring, how do we adapt to it and make it happen in a positive manner?
So we've got two different pieces today, one from the Wall Street Journal and one from the Cincinnati Enquirer. You can find both linked on our website, of course, thestateofus.org, if you'd like to take a look for yourself. From the Wall Street Journal, though, they took the opportunity to calculate a diversity index for each of the nation's more than 3,000 counties based on the U.S. Census Bureau's most recent data using a standard statistical model. Now, nationwide, the diversity index rose 22% during the past 10 years. The county, which is the focus here of today's article, and it features Columbus, Indiana, recorded a 67% gain and was among the fastest in the nation to diversify. Jobs in agriculture, meat processing, manufacturing, and other sectors, as well as a lower cost of living than in many larger metropolitan areas, are attracting immigrants to Middle America. So what's the story, Lance, of Columbus, Indiana?
Well, basically a town of about 50,000. It's 45 minutes south of Indianapolis, along I-65, which is a interstate highway that runs through Indianapolis, north to Chicago and south to Louisville, Kentucky. Very rural region for the most part, farming community. But a town of 50,000 is now seeing that they have the public schools in the area now have students who speak more than 50 different languages. And so it's showing some great changes here. And it says that for the first time, the non-Hispanic white population declined, and from like 87% to 78%. So they're still the majority, but it is getting smaller. A lot of economic growth in the area, and that's pulling in workers from other countries to fill all the jobs because there aren't enough people there to do the jobs, or they're not skilled to do the jobs. And so people are coming in from other places. And I just want to very quickly point out, historically, this is not unknown in the Midwestern part of the United States. In the 1830s and 40s, during what was known as the Great Potato Famine in Ireland, the Irish came to America and they met resistance. Now stop and think about, if you're a listener, what your family tree is. And I hope we have many people with diversity as a part of our audience. But for those of you who, kind of qualify within the group that is seeing a smaller percentage of the population in Columbus, Indiana, we make up a lot of Irish, and I have some Irish blood in me. And in the 1830s and 40s, there were signs that were posted in American businesses and neighborhoods that said, NINA, no Irish need apply. So as we get this pushback of saying, well, I don't want immigrants or they're taking my jobs, this is not new. And to many of the people living in the Midwest, their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents met with some of this resistance. Oh, and the other group that makes up a lot of the Midwestern farmers, the Germans. And the Germans were not welcome. I'm part German as well. And so my ancestors were not welcome to this part of the country when we came here. Now, for the most part in these small rural areas, we are a part of the majority. And so who are we when we stop and think about our historical ancestry to stop others from coming in? It's like, okay, we or our families, our great-grandfathers and grandmothers were disrespected, were abused, were racially attacked, religiously attacked. Okay, I mean, the Germans started their own schools where they could speak German languages. So now are we going to turn around and do the same to other people that are coming in who want to try to achieve the American dream that our families have achieved? That doesn't seem like a very rational way. And I would hope that you would be a catalyst for this change and accept it, because the other thing in Columbus, Indiana is they've seen a major growth in the average income of individuals there. So jobs in the area have increased, as have pay, which means it's a strong economically developing community. And isn't that where you want to live? I don't think you want to live in an economically depressed area. You want to live somewhere where the economy is growing, because that gives you and yours more opportunity. So why fight the change?
Well, they talk about buoyed by strong wages among manufacturers like Cummins, who is, of course, the largest in this county where Columbus, Indiana is. It employs about 9,000 people across the county. The proportion of residents living below the poverty level is lower than the statewide average, and the county's median household income, $72,555, is about 25% higher than Indiana's average.
There you go.
And interestingly, I mean, I didn't know this, Lance, but Cummins has a long history, actually, of promoting and pushing diversity within its ranks. Ever since one of its CEOs was basically very involved in helping organize with Martin Luther King the March on Washington. So they have a long history of this, but they have seen that it's good for their business.
What town in the United States would not want that to be occurring? Well, as they talk about there is obviously some pushback. The ironic thing here, and I think the reason they picked this place, is it is the hometown of former Republican Vice President Mike Pence, which is kind of the epitome of the old Rock Ridge, conservative Midwest small farm community. But I think, what we're showing you here is that diversity has happened in the United States since the beginning of our country, right? I mean, New York was a Dutch colony,
What? So New York.
So,
I thought that was the British.
It was actually
Dutch.
Yeah, it was started by the Dutch. So when we look
New
at
York.
our country,
Got it.
right? Amsterdam, right? New Amsterdam, which later became New York City. Diversity is a part of our history. And instead of fighting, and we have historically, if you look at that, we have fought the diversity, but the diversity part has been able to make this country grow. The early Virginia colony brought in Scandinavians and Germans because of the job skills that were needed to make the colonies grow. They needed to be able to build ships, and to build ships at that time, they needed to be able to cut down trees. So they brought in people who were used to working with trees and building ships from other countries so that they could then cut down the trees and build the ships so that they could send the supplies back to Europe to make money so that the colonies could be thriving. So while we also have a history of fighting diversity in this country, we also have a history of it occurring so that we can grow. And I think we need to understand that and quit the fighting of it and realize that diversity helps us grow. It helps us become a stronger nation. It helps us become a better people. And it helps us become wealthier, and which I think is what everybody wants to do. I don't know, maybe not.
Historically, diversity has been a catalyst, right, of change and generally positive growth in our country. But I think the other thing is we do a little disservice to ourselves because we use buzzwords and we don't always know what they mean, right? And to be clear, I want to talk about two items that I think are really important with this article for people to understand. Diversity as a noun is the practice or quality of including or involving people from a range of different social and ethnic backgrounds and of different genders, sexual orientations, etc.
Means inclusion, right? I mean, bring everybody in.
Well, and to be clear though, because I think this is a misnomer, right? Is if you have Irish and Germans in a town, those are both, quote unquote, white races, so to speak. You say, well, it's not diverse. Well, I think that's one of those areas we do a disservice to, partly because then we ignore the history of there was a time where those people weren't welcome, right? And then we worked to include them, and then they became the norm. And then they may have excluded other people, right? But the disservice that I'm getting at is we don't do history justice by saying, there was probably a time where Lance's ancestors were pretty much German, pretty much Irish, whatever. Well, over the years, inter-ethnic marriage, right? And you come up with people who now they're just white, right? Because there's so many different things going into the background that you don't know about it. But we would all probably do better if we seek to remember that is a large part of how the country started. And that, to your point, Lance, it's really not any different now than it is with what we're having, where we have people that have different skin colors other than white that are from different ethnic groups that are coming in and are further diversifying these areas. But I think it's important to remember because it's so easy to write that off and lump everybody together and then be like, well, there's never really been diversity here. And it's like, well, no, that's probably not true. There probably was diversity at one point.
Yep.
And another thing that I think is important too, because I'll be honest, I don't always get this right. Understanding race and ethnicity, right? Ethnicity is just the fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition, which is why, for example, being German could be an ethnicity, right? Because there's a cultural or common national tradition to the group, where Germans and Irish could both be called white as a race, referring more to the color of their skin, right? So anyway, just some practical things there that I think I understand why people would get confused by all of that. But I think the other thing is we get scared by it and we don't have to, because what this indicates to us is it works out in the end, right? In a positive, very good direction.
Another example of education, the Germans brought in the idea of kindergartens. How many of you grandparents out there and parents sent your children to kindergarten? We
have them to thank for that.
That was not right. And a United States entity that was brought by the Germans for their children to learn, and now it's adopted and is regularly looked upon as a positive when a child starts their school career, their public school career in the United States, public or private school career. So again, to your point of how we assimilate some of these ideas from these diverse group that then become catalysts for our entire system.
Fun facts. So what will this mean moving forward, especially for things like education? Well, when we shift our attention to Indiana's neighboring state, the great state of Ohio, which is where we are recording from today, there are some challenges to this as well, right? And not just people's attitude, but also some institutional things that we have to look at, like the education system. To find out what we're talking about, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. "94% of Ohio's teachers are white. Will that change anytime soon?" Well, that's the question posed by the Inquirer, which is Cincinnati's newspaper, for those that don't know. And the important things to know here, about 1 in 3 Ohio public school districts have a 100% white teaching staff, according to the Ohio Department of Education. Ohio has far fewer minority teachers than minority students in public schools. And you might say, well, why does that matter? Well, because research has consistently shown that teachers of color help students of the same race or ethnicity perform better academically, help white students understand the increasingly diverse cultural world around them, and help their peers stay in the profession longer. The number of minority candidates pursuing teaching degrees in the state's universities has fallen, though, in the past decade, despite multiple efforts to diversify over the past 3 years from the state and individual universities. In the 2019-2020 school year, state data showed that 16.8% of students in Ohio were Black, compared with 4.3% of educators in grades K through 12. So there's clearly a mismatch. The question is, and we have obviously a senior educator here on the program, how big of a problem is this? Because what we just talked about in the first segment is diversity is going up across the Midwest, and this is good, for lots of reasons. At the same time, there's going to be growing pains to that. And teaching faces a whole host of problems, some of which are related to diversity, others of which are not. And Lance ended the last segment by saying the importance of education to making diversification of the Midwest more understandable. But here we have an issue with the teachers. So how big of a problem is this, Lance?
Well, I think it's huge because, just to add to what you said, 6.4% of Ohio students are now Hispanic, but only 0.7% of Ohio teachers were considered Hispanic, and 2.7% of students identified as Asian or Pacific Islander, while only 0.5% of teachers identified as such. The problem is, as they point out, that it helps everybody if you have a more diversified staff, just like it helps everybody, like the Cummins Company, if you have a more diversified workforce, because the more you come in contact with people of different ethnicities and different languages, the more you're exposed to, the more you learn. And what you find out is, oh, we got a lot of things in common. Gee, you want to raise your kids just like I want to raise my kids. You want them to be respectful. You want them to earn a good education. You want them to get a good paying job. You want them to be happy and get married. Wow, you're just like me. And instead, when we're not diversified, we start to think of these people as being different. Think about it, 7:30 to 3, which that's a whole nother ball of wax that we shouldn't be doing. But that's a typical high school day. You're looking at 7.5 hours they're at school. And if they sleep 7.5 or 8 hours, and then if they have a job, okay, they're either sleeping or at school for the majority of their time. And then they're involved in extracurriculars, or they have a job, or both. Mom and dad don't get home till 6 or 7 at night. So they get about 3 hours with mom and dad, or whatever adult influence they have at home. The majority of their time is spent at school. So the more diversified we can make school and make their education experience, the better then that they are equipped to go out into the world and make their way and become successful. If you come from a less diversified background, then you start, as Justin said in the last segment, to think about certain groups in certain ways because you don't know any better. But when diversity happens, then you get to experience them and you're like, wow, they got a lot more in common with me than I ever imagined. And there's a lot more things we have in common than we have that are different.
And if education is going to be one of the keys to understanding diversity, it inevitably raises two important things, right? Number one is, who's going to be teaching that? And I think that that's incredibly important. There's been, I'm sure our listeners are aware of, all this conversation surrounding critical race theory and should it be taught? Should it not be taught? What is it? And I guess what I'm going to, boil it down to, right, is it depends on who you ask what it is that you're talking about and how it's going to be taught. Should we be teaching the history of racism in our country? Should we be talking about race and diversity? I think absolutely. But, and there's a big, caveat here, the way we do that is so very incredibly important, because Lance and I covered several months ago where some of this went awry in some liberal school districts where they were trying to do something they thought was good. And instead, you walked into the school and some parents observed that there were white students sitting in this class and black students sitting in this class and Hispanic students sitting in this class. And everybody was like, whoa, wait a minute here. This doesn't seem like what we're after either. This seems like we're going backwards and accidentally teaching segregation, and that, we can't all sit in the same room and have this conversation. So now, again, this is an extreme example, right? But my point here is that's part of the challenge facing people who are thinking about entering teaching. Am I going to be supported? What am I going to be required to teach? Am I comfortable teaching that? Am I qualified to teach that? I mean, these are big fundamental issues with when you're sending somebody into the profession, right? They may want answers to those questions. And if the answers aren't there, or the answers are murky, or you don't like the answers, those are all going to be very tricky, not just to get diverse candidates into teaching, but also, and I think this is critical as well, to get the, quote unquote, and I hate that, non-diverse candidates, because again, that's boiling people down to, diversity only comes in the form of skin or ethnicity. And in reality, as we've talked about on the show many times, diversity should never be pigeonholed into that, because we also should be interested in a diversity of life experiences, right? Just because you see a white person working in a library doesn't mean that they came from a place where first edition rare books are sitting on their shelves at home. They could have, for all you know, they could have grown up in group homes, right? And books were their gateway to the world. I mean, but that's the point, is we don't ever want to, with any group of people, do that. And that's why I think it's so tricky to get that right. And part of the reason that we see, and this I think is key, the article points out that less than 50% of parents would encourage their kids to become teachers, which is an image problem, right, for education. According to one of the gentlemen that was interviewed for this, he says there's a national narrative about the low respect of teaching as a profession, which has definitely seen a decline. And I think that, if you're not going to, it's hard for anybody to go to work in a profession that you feel is disrespected, right? At the same time, in a profession that's so critically important like this one, if people don't feel like they're respected, which I think is part of what's happening right now, it's even harder to get people into it. It's hard anyway, right? Because it doesn't pay well, doesn't pay very well. And what's at stake is so high. I mean, literally the future of how children are going to operate in the world is in the hands of our teachers. And so the stakes are really high. The pay is not really good. And you top that off with there's not a lot of respect right now for teachers. And the big question of, how is my school going to handle this, right? We're saying that we need to teach these, to teach these things, but how are we going to teach them in a way that doesn't accidentally encourage racial and ethnic division?
Okay, if you're listening and you're kind of starting to understand, wow, it would be really, it sounds like it's important if we want to grow as a nation that we need to recruit more minority candidates in the classroom to meet the diversity, because it not only helps the children of that ethnicity, but it helps all children to become a student of the world so that they can understand and become successful in working within that. Not only does it show that there is parents would discourage their children to become teachers. And the thing about that, just anecdotally, I know people that I taught with who tried to get their children not to become teachers because they chose it as a profession and they saw this disrespect that was going around and they tried not to. And just so you know, one of my two children are teachers, and people said, how could you let her do that? And I said, because that's what she wanted to do. She wanted to help people. And how can you stop your children from doing what is going to make them happy? But think about this, okay? We've talked about on this show the cost of going to college, right? Well, with that high debt that students are taking in, the minimum starting salary for teachers in Ohio with a bachelor's degree by law is only $30,000 a year. You're not going to get too many people who are incurring $80,000 to $100,000 or more for a 4-year degree that is required. A 4-year degree is required to be a teacher in the state of Ohio to then graduate and only make $30,000 a year. And then when you do your student teaching, you have 12 weeks of unpaid teaching that you do. You go into the classroom and you take over. You're the teacher for 12 weeks. And since you're the teacher, it's very difficult to work to then pay your bills for those 3 months that you're doing that. So to your point, there's a lot of problems here when you think of the importance that we place on educating our children and the roadblocks we put up for people who want to become teachers because we want the very best to be the ones who are teaching our children. Yet we're going to disrespect them once they get there. Some issues here I think we need to talk about, Justin.
Well, we're going to talk about them, but to find out what we have to say, you're going to have to keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. One part of the article that stuck out to me as we talk about what barriers we're putting in way to becoming teachers, and you say, well, how did we get onto this? I thought we were talking about diversity. Well, if you want greater diversity in your teaching, you have to look at what are the problems and barriers to entry for teaching. Because as we know, historically speaking, whatever barriers you can identify, they probably disproportionately affect people of minorities or people who live in poverty, or in many cases, if those are the same, then obviously they're getting double jeopardy, which is no good. So that's why we have to talk about it. And as we identified in the first segment, what's one of the keys to getting education on diversity right? Good teachers. Because if they're going to be teaching it, you've got to have good people teaching it in order to get good answers on it. And I just want to say, before we go into this, because I've been meaning to say it all episode, I hope our listeners know, Lance and I loathe the checking a box for the box's sake, right? I just had to fill out a grant, or I had a question from our grant writing firm the other day, Lance, for the Urbana Youth Center. And this place wants to know, what percentage of senior leadership is female, is LGBTQ, is Black, is anything other than white, that they want to know that. And the thing, I know why they want to know. And the frustrating thing is that the programs they're funding have nothing to do with that at all, and you could say, yeah, but what they're trying to do is make sure that they fund initiatives that have diverse workforces. If I honestly believe that's why they're doing it with it, I wouldn't have so much of a problem. I think they're doing it to check a box. I don't buy that they genuinely give a damn, because if they did, then they would be asking about how the program is going to further that, not just what your data is.
Well, too many times we try to equate race with poverty, and poverty is poverty. Doesn't matter what your racial or ethnic background is. Poverty is poverty, and you face the same problems. And I think that's a misnomer that I think you're trying to correct, and that we need to correct as a nation. That we equate poverty with race, and that's not the fact. It doesn't matter what race you come from. If you're experiencing poverty, you're experiencing the same things.
So
I don't know if you agree with that or not. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement on
is a bold statement
on my point.
I mean,
I understand there are differences. There are slight differences, but having dealt with children of poverty for the last 40 years of my life, going hungry doesn't matter what color you are. Having a mattress to sleep on doesn't matter. Having clean clothes to choose from in your closet, it transcends race.
The correlation between race and poverty, as we've discussed on this show before, deals with our historic issues with housing, right? And segregation that led to the reality that a large portion of people living in poverty also happen to be minorities. But it's important that we follow it in that order, right? It's not you're black, therefore you are somebody who lives in poverty. No, it's, I live in poverty and I am black, and there's a higher percentage of us because many, many years of, and we covered that actually a couple of years ago in the book Barrio America, which is all about Chicago and its historic issues with housing and how even today they're struggling with that because it's a very tricky thing to break once it's in place.
Laws were passed by the local government saying where different ethnic groups could live.
Right. And then when those became illegal after the 1964 civil rights stuff, then they just changed the wording of the laws to not basically spell out race, but to still spell out race as part of it. So yes, poverty has been a tool that has been used by people in power to keep repressed the people they don't like, which unfortunately often involves racism. At the same time, to Lance's point, there are people living in poverty all over the country of all different races and backgrounds, and poverty is also an issue that we have to address. And it's unfortunate that there are situations like this where we may very well not get those funds, right? But are you going to tell me that, the kid who, like you said, goes home and doesn't have a mattress here in Urbana, Ohio, or who doesn't have a food on the table is any less important than the kid, in Brooklyn with the same problem? Just because one's white and the other one's black, they don't both deserve to have a bed and food. I mean, again,
well, I guess
that's the trick with the checking the box thing that we have to be careful of. It's talking the same thing about critical race theory. The motivation, no, not everybody's motivation is pure. Yes, I understand that there are people out there who are trying to teach critical race theory that have bad motivation. I get that. But what I'm saying is, on the whole, the purpose of it, right, that might be pure. The way we're executing some of these things can be very dangerous. Checking a box is the same reason that we have this huge issue with the criminal justice system, right? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Check here. Doesn't ask if I served my prison sentence, doesn't ask how long ago it is, doesn't ask what I've done to reform myself, doesn't mind that I've paid my time, right? And we know that's a huge problem in this country. And here we are doing the same kind of stuff with race.
My point was that the catalyst to helping people should be poverty, not race. If the catalyst were poverty and we didn't worry about racial or ethnic backgrounds or gender stereotypes or whatever, and we just worried about poverty, then we could help everybody who needs it and not get caught up in what else is going on. Now, you brought up an interesting question, and I'm just going to say for my teacher friends here, those of us in the classroom or who have been in the classroom, we get tired of people on the outside telling us what we should do and how we should do it and what we should teach when we were the ones who have the degree. I don't walk into General Motors and tell them how to build a car because I am not an engineering major and did not study that. So just because I would like to have big fins and a dome over the top that's a see-through dome instead of a hard steel or metal composite of some sort, that doesn't mean that I get to come in and tell you how to put your product together. And those of us who are in education, who have trained for it, who have multiple degrees in it, who have spent time constructing our craft to be the best that we can be, we get really tired with and I know this is controversial, but we get tired of politicians and parents telling us how to teach their children because we are the ones who have spent a lifetime getting a degree and studying this stuff and have sacrificed in many, many ways to do what's best for young people. It's been my job and my career to figure out what they need to know and the best way to teach them. I don't want somebody coming in who's never been a teacher, who's never gotten any kind of teacher training to come in and tell me what I need to teach and how I need to teach it. Just like I wouldn't dare to do that, to come into your job and tell you how to scan groceries or how to design an automobile or how to build an airplane or how to wait on tables or whatever, or how to do your plumbing. That's why I'm glad there's diversity in the workforce with those kind of jobs, because I need those people to do the jobs for me.
What would happen if each school district convened their teachers and said, we think that it's important that we do a good job of communicating the issues around race and racism in this country. How do you, our teachers who live in this community, who see these students every day, how do you think we should go about doing that? What would be the best approach to take?
Empower the worker.
Well,
I'm raising the banner. I agree. I agree 100%.
It just seems like it fixes this issue of,
sure it does.
We give respect to the teachers, which we say is a major barrier to people becoming teachers. And we address this issue of, what do we do about diversity? Well, if people hear that the teachers are being asked and that they have, a real say in how it's going to be taught, I don't know. Maybe that's crazy. Let us know. Send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org. Diversity is rising in the Midwest, and the question becomes, how are we going to teach this to make sure that some of those big societal issues we do a better job at handling?
Well, because we want to be a catalyst for change. But just so I don't get in trouble, we also have a mission statement here for the company I work for. And True Chat's mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've had that today. We've laid it on the line. We've said some things that I think are pretty bold and hopefully gets you to talking around where you work and where you live, so that you can have those honest and respectful conversations so we can make some positive change in this country. And as you're talking to people and they say, well, where can I find this show that sounds like something interesting that I would like to participate in so I can have these conversations, and tell them as a podcast, we can be found on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere else podcasts are found.
I think people will find that our mission statement is indeed a catalyst for change, and that if we deploy those principles, then we're going to see the Midwest hopefully transform into a place of economic hub of activity again, being a catalyst not only for itself, but also for the entire nation. There was a time where that was very much true, and I think that it's on the horizon again, especially given some of the components that we've seen recently. So The State of Us can be found Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast first thing in the morning and on the weekends in select talk radio markets. I think I've got a tie today on the word of the day. So
I was trying to get you a win, Justin. The audience is starting to think I'm beating you over the head and I'm winning too much. I don't want to become
rigging the system.
Yeah, I don't want to become the New York Yankees of the word of the day. So I was trying to throw you a bone there, but the best you could come up with was a tie, huh? All right. Yep. Well, I'll keep working to be that catalyst of change. Oh! And I get the win. All right.
For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in wherever you are in the nation. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.